Hello and good evening. Tonight we are going to talk about how has cultural assimilation and accommodations affected the education of English language learners in the United States. In the early part of the 20th century, Jean Piaget began his studies of how assimilation and accommodations can help students learn a concept. In the past, assimilation and accommodations had rarely been seen as reasonable expectation for all learners, especially for those who have a language barrier to overcome to become competent in the English language. We need to ask, how has cultural assimilation and accommodation affected the education of English language learners in the United States? So first we're going to look at forced assimilation. So when looking at through history, forced assimilation and accommodation of Native Americans brought forth a pattern that we still see today when it comes to English language learners. Forced assimilation is where culture is involuntarily assimilated into another culture or religion by being forced to adopt traditions, languages, values, morals, customs, and a way of life different from their own. For example, when the Europeans settled in Canada, they considered themselves superior in every single way to the natives. The Europeans embarked on a centuries-long project with catastrophic consequences to save and civilize the indigenous people. They looked to the United States for inspiration and established the residential school system in the 1880s. In 1920, it became mandatory for indigenous children to attend residential schools, and they no longer had no other legal option for education. The stated belief of Canada was that unless forced to assimilate, the indigenous people and Canada as a whole would never flourish. The schools forced assimilation by cutting the children's hair short in the European style, dressing them like Europeans, and only allowing English in school. They even separated siblings, severing the last ties of family and culture. The children were subjected to physical, emotional, and spiritual abuse, malnutrition, and poor health care. Between 1883 and 1997, more than 150,000 children were torn from their homes, starting at the age of 6. The last residential school did not close until 1996, which means there are still survivors today. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a 6-page volume final report which concluded that the residential school system had attempted cultural genocide. It can easily be argued the system was attempting literal genocide as well. Mass graves have been found at many of the schools, and these children died from all the poor conditions listed earlier: malnutrition, abuse, to name a few. In 2021, Telkom T. Sepkom First Nation reported that ground-penetrating radar had identified 200 potential burial sites at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Canada's assimilation campaign was presented as beneficial to the indigenous people, but it did destroy cultural, inflict trauma, and kill children. Canada continues to face a reckoning regarding its violations of human rights. The second key point we're going to look at is biculturalism. Psychology Today says biculturalism is a personal blend of one's cultural heritage and lived experience rather than combining two cultures or cultural feelings split. Biculturalism can be framed as reconciliation of cultures. Seth Swartz, a professor of public health, finds that biculturalism leads to higher self-esteem, less anxiety, less depression, and better family relations. Fully assimilated people experience worse outcomes. This type of situation is known as the immigrant paradox. Rather than fully incorporating, it is possible to integrate elements of multiple cultures, creating something unique and satisfying to each individual. The last key point is cultural and language accommodations. Actual exposure to a foreign culture through living in the country is expected to create the highest likelihood of assimilation of different values. In spite of this, by simply using the language of the culture in question, individuals can adjust their thoughts and behavior to accommodate cultural norms associated with that language. Yang and Bond did a study in 1980 suggesting that when forced to use the assimilation language, individuals might subconsciously be influenced by the new culture. They acquire some of the attitudes and values associated with the culture through a process called cultural accommodation. It is believed that language determines the way we think. People who speak a different language tend to live in a different world. They do not live in the same world with objects, events, and concepts. In today's society, this is not widely accepted. The argument, however, is that language may play a role in how psycholinguistic concepts are accepted. So while the cultural and language accommodation and assimilation can build a national common language and culture, it is slowly destroying other cultures that could be lost completely. One of the best examples is the Native American culture and languages. Every day there are fewer and fewer tribesmen who speak or know their cultural traditions of their tribes. Some tribes are down to as few as 7 people who are left that can pass on the traditions and speak their native languages. Soon there may be none. We are a nation in need of seeing the value of preserving our dying cultures and languages while we move forward blending our cultures together. Thank you.